These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? The dominant feature of the position is White's battery of queen and rook on the d-file. He almost can mate with queen moves to d8, but Black's rook guards the square. And he almost can play queen moves to d7, checkmate. Except that Black's queen guards d7. Focus on one point at a time. Since White is prevented from playing queen moves to d7 by Black's queen, try attacking Black's queen and see what would happen. How can White do that? With rook takes at a6, don't overlook squares just because there are pawns on them. Now we are in a familiar situation where if the queen captures its attacker, queen takes rook, White mates immediately. And Black has nowhere to move his queen where it would be safe, i.e., not on the 6th rank or d-file, yet still would protect the mating square d7. So Black might instead consider rook takes rook. But now he has moved the sole guard of the other mating square, allowing White to play queen moves to d8, checkmate. Thus after White plays rook takes at a6, Black's only way to avoid mate is by interposing his bishop in front of White's battery with bishop moves to d6, thus forfeiting his queen to rook takes queen. The position might seem a little complicated because of White's double threat on d7 and d8. It can be seen in simple and familiar terms. When Black's queen is attacked, it cannot afford to save itself because mate then results on d7, Black therefore has to let go of the queen and add some new substitute protection against mate. The wrinkle is just that Black has another way to get rid of the attacker, by using his rook, but this doesn't work, either, because Black's rook also defends a mating square. This isn't difficult if you are clear on the multiple ways White almost can mate and the roles that Black's pieces play in preventing it. Black to move. What is the best move? White's knight has forked your queen and f8 rook. What to do? Don't be quick to think defensively, calmly consider your own offensive options. Start by observing the action on White's back rank. His king is stuck there, almost enabling Black to mate with rook takes rook, but White's queen guards his rook on f1. This makes the queen vulnerable, its ability to fend off an attack against itself is limited. So Black looks for a way to attack it. Better still, he looks for a way to attack it and attack something else at the same time. Noticing that White's knight on e6 is loose, Black plays queen moves to d7, a fork of White's queen and knight. Ordinarily a queen makes a poor target for a queen fork, but this is one of those cases where if the attacked queen strikes back, mate results. We saw a bunch of these positions in our studies of double attacks by the queen. White's preference would be to move the queen to a square where it is safe and can guard the knight and the mating square f1, so he plays queen moves to c4. It's important to ask whether such a substitute square exists, and to see this one, but then important also to notice that by guarding those 2 points the queen is left overworked. Black therefore goes ahead with rook takes rook, check. Requiring the reply queen takes rook, and now black has queen takes knight, winning a piece. As you might expect when you start with an attack of this sort, there are other ways the position can play out, too, and you want to see them. After black's initial queen moves to d7, white can play rook takes rook, and then, after black plays queen takes queen, white has knight takes rook f8, winning the exchange after black recaptures with bishop takes knight f8. This way black ends up winning a queen and a knight for 2 rooks. White to move. What is the best move? With black's king stuck firmly in the corner, you might naturally think here about mating on the back rank. Queen moves to f8 almost would do it for white, but black's queen guards the needed square. Don't stop there, notice also that since the black king has no flight squares, merely planting a piece on the diagonal leading toward it, as with queen moves to f6, also would be checkmate, except that black guards f6 with his queen and knight. In view of these threats the black queen helps prevent. Turn your attention to ways you can go after it or take something it protects. Either way you are led to rook takes at b7. Observe the difficulty of black's resulting position. A. His queen is under attack but doesn't dare defend itself, as queen takes rook results in queen moves to f8, checkmate. For white. B. Another way for black to try to rescue his queen is by interposing his knight from e8 to c7, but then white renews the threat with rook takes knight. Notice the significance of the black knight's move to c7, it stops white's threat of mate with queen moves to f8, because now the way is clear for black's rook to prevent the square regardless of what happens to his queen. On the other hand, one of the defenders of f6, the knight now has moved away, leaving black's queen with sole responsibility for preventing queen moves to f6, checkmate. So rook takes knight is just as worrisome for black as white's original rook takes at b7. If black now recaptures queen takes rook, the f6 square is left loose and white mates soon from there. C. Trying to rescue his queen thus is futile, and black is better off spending his time addressing the mate threat directly by replying to rook takes at b7 with knight moves to g7. Like the other move of that knight just considered, this clears the back rank for defense of f8 by black's rook, plus it blocks the dark squared diagonal. Then after white plays rook takes queen, black has end pawn from c6 takes rook. Not great, but it avoids mate for now. Again we see the importance of not being satisfied when you identify one near mate. Find all of them, for it may be that at least some ways of fending off the first will expose your opponent to the second, or third, etc. White to move. What is the best move? Flush attacks against the queen. That last position involved a flush attack on the queen. White planted a rook right next to it. Let us continue to look at this theme more closely. The logic of it is no different than in the previous set of positions. We study these cases separately just because the act of moving a piece up next to the enemy queen without any protection can seem counterintuitive. It is useful to see a bunch of positions where this is done deliberately and productively so that you will feel at home with it. We start on the left with a simple case. Identifying white's double threat against a square adjacent to black's king should be no trouble. He almost can mate with queen moves to g7. What prevents this is black's queen on f8. The natural thought is to do something to pressure or dislodge the guard. White has one way to attack black's queen without disturbing his mate threat. He plays rook moves to e8, sticking a rook flush against the queen and thus putting the queen into an untenable position. Now analyze black's possible responses and their consequences. In response to each of them, consider what checks you could give or whether you can mate. If black plays queen takes rook, white mates with queen moves to g7. Indeed, since black's queen now is pinned, the only way he can avoid being mated on g7 next move is by playing king moves to f7, in which event he instead is mated with queen takes queen. To repeat, in a sense this is just another case like the most recent batch. A queen guarding against mate is attacked. Our particular goal here is just to get used to the practice and the sight of planting a loose piece right next to an enemy queen. It looks strange at first but is a useful device. White to move. What is the best move? Notice that black's bishop on g7 is pinned, and that white has both his bishop and queen aimed at g7, even if the bishop's path isn't clear yet. In this sense black's knight on f6 is pinned as well. How to exploit the situation? Play through what you would like to be able to do. White would like to be able to play bishop takes knight f6, taking advantage of the pin on the g7 bishop and following up with queen takes bishop, checkmate. He can't, because black's queen guards f6. So he turns his attention to the queen. He can attack it with rook takes at d7, which incidentally forks black's loose bishop on b7 as well. Black is confronted with a familiar choice. He has nowhere to put the queen where it will be safe and still protect f6. If he tries to save his queen by playing queen takes rook, he gets mated. He is better off letting go of the queen and looking for another way to fend off the mate threat, such as pawn from e6 moves to e5. Now white plays rook takes queen. Black to move. What is the best move? This position is more advanced than the others we have seen in this chapter because it requires you to keep track of some variations. At a glance you should see that Black's knight is about to get taken. You also should see the concentration of Black's forces against the White king. Black's bishop seals off b1 and c2, and his knight and rook form the kernel of a discovery. Knight moves to b3, check. Or knight moves to e2, check. Almost mating by giving check with the knight and sealing off the king's remaining flight squares with the rook. The mate is thwarted by White's queen on a4, which guards b3, and by the bishop on f3, which protects e2. Focus on the impediment to knight moves to b3, check. Threaten the White queen, and see if the threat leads either to its capture or to the abandonment of its defensive duties. Black has one way to so attack it without fouling up his mate threat. He plays the flush attack. Queen moves to a5. Of course this leaves Black's queen en prize. He hopes White will take it, since knight moves to b3, checkmate. Then follows. But in reply to a mere attack there typically is more than one possible move, so think carefully about what else White might do with his queen. Look for another square where it could keep doing the same thing, someplace safe where it would continue to guard b3. Answer, d1. So imagine White's queen there and ask what comes next. Think in checks. Black can go ahead with knight moves to b3, check. And allow White to play queen takes knight, then Black brings in his queen from its new position with queen moves to d2, checkmate. Putting it next to White's king with protection from the rook on d8, a classic queen plus mate. White has another option in reply to queen moves to a5, he can play bishop moves to d1. Notice that this protects his queen and also adds another defender to b3. Keep thinking in checks. How many would Black have after White's bishop moves to d1? 2, either of which win the game. Knight moves to b3, check. Forces White to capture on b3 with his queen or bishop. Either way, Black has queen moves to d2, checkmate. Or Black can reply to bishop moves to d1 with knight moves to e2, check. Which requires White to capture with bishop takes knight. As before, Black then has queen moves to d2, checkmate. So White's best reply to queen moves to a5 turns out to be abandonment of the queen in favor of a different attempt to forestall mate the simple pawn from e3 takes knight, removing Black's knight. In addition to winning White's queen, Black still has an eventual mate, but now it takes considerably longer as he has to chase White's king around, perhaps all the way over to the h-file with his queen, bishop, and rook. This position illustrates one of our recurring themes in this section. When you attack the defender of a mating square, the dividends can be very great, but analysis also can be a good deal more complicated than it would be if you were working just with checks and captures, because your opponent has a wider choice of replies. You have to think hard about where the attacked piece might be moved and how you might follow up, and about what captures or attacks of his own he might be able to spring. White to move. What is the best move? Now back to another family of mating patterns we frequently consider, the tightly constrained king. White's e4 bishop is threatened by the pawn on f5, but of course you decline to retreat until you have studied your attacking options. Examine the Black king's position and you see that it has no flight squares, it is frozen on g8, with an open diagonal leading toward it. Consider this an invitation to put an attacker on that diagonal, since the king won't be able to run away from it. Does white have a piece usable for the purpose? He could try bishop moves to d5, check. But black has the square protected with his rook as well as his queen. So white tries his other resource for attacking on a diagonal, his queen, which he might play to c4. This fails because, again, black guards c4 with his queen. So the next thought is to put pressure on black's queen, and one way to do this is by putting one of your pieces flush against it as with rook moves to a1. Black's goal now is familiar. Can he move his queen someplace where it, a, is safe and, b, still protects the mating square c4? No. The a-file is off limits, and the queen has no safe squares on the light squared diagonal it is trying to protect. So perhaps it appears that rook moves to a1 ends the game. Not quite, however, there is another line of response for black. He can attack white's queen with knight moves to d4. It's a familiar defensive idea. If you can't stop your opponent's attack on one of your pieces, make a similar attack on one of his pieces. White isn't fazed by this, though, as he has a couple of fine options in reply. A. He can go ahead and trade queens with 2. Rook takes queen, knight takes queen. A few positions ago we saw a similar situation and emphasized the importance of not assuming that you should liquidate in this way. That was true, you shouldn't assume it. It depends on what the board looks like before and after such a liquidation occurs. Here, after 1. Rook moves to a1, knight moves to d4, 2. Rook takes queen, knight takes queen. White now has attacks against 2 loose pieces, black's knight, which sits loose next to white's king, and black's bishop, which is loose on b7. So white wins a piece with 3. Bishop takes bishop. And then a pawn, 2, after 3, knight moves to d4, 4. Rook takes at a7. b, or white could reply to 1. Knight moves to d4 with 2. Bishop takes knight. Now he has a piece, and if black plays 2. Queen takes rook, trying to win the exchange, white has 3. Queen moves to c4, check. And mate soon thereafter. The resulting position is shown in the next frame. Black to move. What is the best move? Play from this point goes 3. Bishop moves to d5, useless interposition, 4. Bishop takes bishop, check. Not queen takes bishop, check. d5 is guarded by black's rook, pawn from e7 moves to e6, useless interposition, 5. Bishop takes at e6, check. Rook moves to f7, useless interposition though it gives the king a flight square, 6. Bishop takes rook, check. King moves to f8, forced, 7. Knight moves to h7, check. Don't forget the knight, king moves to e7, forced, 8. Queen moves to e6, checkmate. If black instead plays 4, rook takes bishop, which might have occurred to you, this merely gives white a safe chance to play 5. Queen takes rook, check. And mate even more quickly, 5, pawn from e7 moves to e6, useless interposition, 6. Queen takes at e6, check. Rook moves to f7, forced useless interposition, 7. Queen takes rook, checkmate. It is worth spending the time needed to visualize these mating sequences from the original diagrammed position just for the sake of getting some exercise. But if black is alert, he of course will avoid all this, replying to bishop takes knight with bishop moves to a6 and thus counter-attacking against white's queen. This way he loses only a piece. Conclusion, after 1. Rook moves to a1, knight moves to d4, black's best reply, white should play the a line above, not the b, because a wins him a pawn as well as a piece. White to move. What is the best move? Loose piece alert, black has won on g4. Study whether you can attack it while also attacking black's king or threatening mate at the same time. These investigations lead you to queen takes at e6, check. A rough draft of a queen fork. But of course you first would need to chase away the guard of the forking square, black's queen. You have one way to attack it, rook moves to c7. Flush attacks like this should come easily to you now. The problem with this one, though, is that white loses the rook to queen takes rook and doesn't quite make up for it with the fork. Think, if only the rook had protection when it jumped to c7. It almost does, if the pawn on b5 were one square closer, so now you have a new goal, get your b-pawn forward one square. You can't play it to b6 now because black just takes it with his own pawn on a7. But if the a7 pawn were replaced with a black piece, you could push your b-pawn forward with a threat. At last the winning idea comes into view, one bishop takes at a7, rook takes bishop, 2 pawn from b5 moves to b6. Black moves his rook, probably to a6. Now you are ready to safely play 3. Rook moves to c7, queen moves to e8, 4. Queen takes at e6, check. Queen moves to f7, interposing, 5. Queen takes knight, at last, rook takes at b6, black takes the annoying pawn. This was why he played his rook to a6 on his second move. For all this trouble, what has white won? A pawn. And the pawn is won even more simply if black sees all this coming and simply declines to recapture after 1. Bishop takes at a7. Well, sometimes that's chess, it can take a lot of work to win a pawn. Black to move. What is the best move? Threats against rooks and minor pieces. Our focus has been on attacks against the enemy king and queen when they guard pieces or mating squares. Attacks against minor pieces can be effective, too, though they are more complicated because in these cases it is less costly for your opponent to leave the guard where it is, exposed to capture, while launching a threat of his own elsewhere. A threat against a minor piece thus works best when accompanied by a larger threat, especially check. After the relatively demanding positions we have been considering, the one to the left should seem easy. Back to first principles, you want to be aware of every point in white's camp that black has under attack. Here black's queen attacks white's knight on e2. So you look at how the knight is protected and see the rook behind it. You can't capture the rook, can you drive it away? Rooks flee knights and bishops, and black has a dark squared bishop that he can play to f2. If white leaves the rook where it is, he loses the exchange. If he moves it, he loses the knight, for there is no place for the rook to go where it will be safe and still protect e2. The root of the problem for white is that his rook is cramped against the edge of the board. If white's knight and rook pair were in the middle of the board, the rook could retreat and still provide defense. White to move. What is the best move? What does white attack? If you don't see it, you're overlooking the king, which attacks black's knight. Next question, what prevents king takes knight? The bishop on e6. White has no way to capture it, but he can attack it with bishop moves to c8. A foolish move, since it invites black to play bishop takes bishop, taking a piece while still protecting the knight. No, because in playing bishop takes bishop black would be depositing his bishop onto the back rank, where his king sits. White then would have a check and capture with rook takes bishop, check. And then after black moves his king comes king takes knight, winning a piece for white. The priority of check again. So once white plays bishop moves to c8, black is destined to lose his piece, and black's best move thus is knight takes at f2, allowing his knight to be captured but at least taking a pawn with it as it goes down. White to move. What is the best move? White has three pieces trained on the black king's general position, and the king has little mobility and is short on defenders. These indicators suggest the possibility of a mating attack, but how? The obvious checking idea, queen takes at f6, almost mates, but the pawn has protection from the rook on f8. The rook cannot be taken, so consider pressuring it. White plays rook moves to e8, attacking the rook. This may look counterintuitive because now white's rook can be taken, but of course if that happens white mates on his next move. In this sense black's rook is pinned. The power of rook moves to e8 is that it starts a sequence in which white dictates black's replies one by one. Here black has to play king moves to g7, as it is the only move that avoids immediate mate and provides protection for the rook. White plays rook takes rook, black plays king takes rook. Now comes queen takes at f6, check. And black's king does not have enough room. White mates a few moves later with his queen and bishop. After 1. Rook moves to e8, king moves to g7, 2. Rook takes rook, king takes rook, the sequence, entirely forced, goes 3. Queen takes at f6, check. King moves to e8, 4. Bishop moves to f7, check. King moves to d7, 5. Queen moves to e6, check. King moves to d8, 6. Queen moves to e8, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? Black's king can't move to d8, and f7 is off limits as well. Indeed, it has no flight squares and there is an open diagonal leading toward it. We know a way to take advantage of this: try to get an attacker onto the diagonal, exploiting the king's cramped position. White looks to his queen and light squared bishop, and finds the move bishop moves to f7 almost mate, with protection from the knight on e5, but f7 is guarded by black's rook on h7. When an otherwise effective mate threat is impeded by an enemy piece, we know how to think about this: we make the troublesome piece a focus of operations in its own right. Capturing the rook is not possible, but white can get an attacker onto the h-file with queen takes at h5, check. Notice that in addition to attacking black's rook, this move gives check. This has the usual importance because it makes black's choice of replies much more limited than it was in the cases where we tried planar attacks against enemy pieces. Black has no way to protect his king except rook takes queen, or rook moves to f7, and white mates on f7 with his bishop. Lesson: if a troublesome enemy piece can be attacked with check, this generally is an attractive way to go. The threat to the enemy king simplifies your analysis of the consequences. White to move. What is the best move? Do you see that this position is structurally similar to the previous one? Again, black's king has no flight squares. Again, there is an open diagonal leading toward it, though from below, making it a little harder to see, and again all that prevents white from mating by planting a bishop on that diagonal. Bishop moves to g7, is black's rook. So white sticks his queen flush against the rook with queen moves to f8, check. Choosing the attacking square that also enables his queen to give check and thus force the issue. Black's only replies are rook takes queen or rook moves to g7, permitting white to play bishop moves to g7, checkmate. Or bishop takes rook g7 hashtag, next move. The point about giving check can be made more strongly by looking at black's own threats at the other end of the board. Black has a queen, 2 rooks, and a bishop all trained on the white king's position. If white plays a different attack on black's rook, say, queen moves to d8 rather than queen moves to f8, check. Black is not forced to take any defensive measures. Instead, black gives a check of his own with queen takes at g2, check. And his checks don't stop until white is mated 3 moves later. By giving check himself with queen moves to f8, check. White holds the initiative and never gives black a chance to start his own mating sequence. White to move. What is the best move? Examine black's king and be struck by its limited range of motion, none, thanks to the attack on g8 by white's bishop. In these circumstances any check becomes a mating threat. White's rook takes knight would be mate except that black's rook on c8 guards the mating square. Can white somehow be rid of the black rook? He can't capture it, and if he attacks it, black might just leave the rook where it is, comfortable in the knowledge that it is protected by its queen and that if it is replaced by its queen, the back rank still is defended. But the calculus changes if white can attack black's rook while also creating another threat. So then notice another significance in the fact that white's bishop on b3 is aimed at g8, next to black's king. It gives white a classic queen fork of a black piece and mating square with queen moves to c4. Ordinarily the move wouldn't look like much because black can just play rook takes queen. But here that capture is exactly what white wants black to play, and what black does not want to play, because it results in a mate for white with rook takes knight. It does not matter what black does, of course, since if he plays anything other than rook takes queen, example queen moves to e6, he soon ends up mated by queen moves to g8, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? Forking the guard and another piece. As we have seen, an attack on a defender of an enemy piece or sensitive square works best when it has something else going for it as well. For example, if the move also gives check or threatens mate, or if the piece being attacked is in an unusually cramped position. Moves that give check and also attack the defender you are trying to remove can also be understood as forks, and lesser but still effective forks are possible in which you attack the defender and some enemy piece other than his king. In cases such as those, where your attack on the guard is part of a double attack, simply moving the defender to a safe place no longer gets your opponent out of trouble, the other piece in the fork remains vulnerable. These sorts of forks also allow you a broader range of targets than usual. Ordinarily a knight forking a rook and a protected bishop is no great threat, since once the rook moves you are faced just with an exchange of minor pieces. But if moving the rook would leave something else loose, the fork becomes interesting after all. In the position to the left, white sizes up his attacking options and sees that he attacks black's knight twice. It also is defended twice. He has no way to capture either defender, but he can attack both of them with the knight fork. Knight moves to b6. Black is threatened with the loss of his rook, so he must move it to safety, and he can do this while still protecting the a8 bishop by playing rook moves to b8. But now the knight has lost one of its defenders, so white can play bishop takes knight. Or white can play knight takes bishop, and if black recaptures rook takes knight, then both defenders of black's knight are gone, enabling it to be taken for free. Next move. White wins a piece in any event. Observe how the fork gave black a narrower set of choices than we saw in cases where a guard was attacked without more. The trouble created by a fork cannot be evaded by just moving the attacked piece, because there are two of them. And notice that while a knight fork of a rook and a protected bishop usually would be of little interest, it is another matter when capturing the bishop would leave an additional target loose for the taking. Black to move. What is the best move? The current idea from black's side. The opportunity to see is the attack on white's knight by black's rook. The knight is guarded by a fellow piece, the bishop on b2, making it vulnerable. The bishop cannot be captured, and if attacked it presumably would just retreat to a1 unless the attack were a fork that made a simple retreat unsatisfactory. Black looks for ways to attack the bishop, or for knight forks, and finds knight moves to c4. White is threatened with the loss of the exchange, but he can create no better outcome. If he moves the d2 rook to c2 or e2, he saves it and protects his bishop, but after white plays knight takes bishop and black replies rook takes knight, black's knight on c3 has been left loose and is lost to rook takes knight. Next move. White is better off moving his knight from c3 to e2, allowing black to take the exchange rather than letting him win a whole piece. Incidentally, suppose white instead replies to the fork knight moves to c4 by retreating his bishop to a1. Here as before, black wins the exchange by taking white's rook. But this time the trouble continues for white, because after he recaptures rook takes knight, his bishop on a1 has been left loose. This creates the kernel of a relative pin on the long diagonal, and black exploits it with bishop moves to e5. Suddenly the knight on c3 is paralyzed. Black can win it in return for a couple of pawns. After black plays bishop moves to e5, play might go 1. Rook takes rook, knight takes rook, 2. Bishop moves to b7, rook moves to c7, 3. Bishop takes at a6, bishop takes knight, 4. Bishop takes bishop, rook takes bishop, 5. Bishop takes at b5. The point is just to see again how hazardous it can be to leave a piece loose in the middle of a sequence, perhaps in the course of retreating it innocently. For once it is loose, other pieces can be forked along with it or, as in this case, pinned to it. White to move. What is the best move? White sees that the queens are faced off against each other and that black's queen, like his own, is protected only by a piece, the knight on c6. White has no way to capture the knight, and the knight has protection, so if white merely attacks it with a move like bishop moves to b5, black is free to preempt white's plans with a forcing move of his own, queen takes queen, check. White needs a way to attack the knight while controlling the initiative. He examines other ways of going after it, and he examines any checks he can give. Either way he is drawn to knight moves to e7, check. Forking black's knight and king. Black must save his king either by moving it or by taking white's knight. If he takes the knight with knight takes knight, he leaves his queen loose and allows white to play queen takes queen. If he moves his king to b8 or d8, now what? Keep looking for the next check, especially when your knight is creating havoc and forcing the enemy king to move around. Successive knight moves often can create successive checks and forks. White thus plays knight takes knight, check. This time forking black's king and queen. Again black must either move his king or, better, take white's knight. Either way his queen is loose and ends up lost. Next move. Black to move. What is the best move? White's pawn on h3 is about to take black's knight. The easy thought is to retreat the knight, but of course that would be rash. You see that the knight and black's queen both are aimed at h2, and indeed that queen moves to h2 would be mate if white's knight on f3 were not defending the mating square. Black has no way to capture the bothersome knight, but perhaps he fruitfully can threaten it. Now of course attacking a knight with another piece generally will not frighten your opponent, particularly in a case like this where the knight is defended. But it's different when the attack is a fork, such as black's end pawn from c6 moves to d4 attacking the white knight and queen. A knight fork against a fellow knight usually is no good, but here it is as good as forking the king. White absolutely cannot afford to play knight takes knight, as it permits mate on the move for black. Yet if white tries to save his queen, as with queen moves to d1, black plays knight takes knight and mates a move later. We thus arrive at a familiar outcome. White's only recourse is to let go of the attacked pieces and take other measures to defend against mate here, by playing pawn from h3 takes knight. Now black wins the queen with knight takes queen. White to move. What is the best move? White's queen is loose and under attack. Then again, black's queen also is loose. So you might naturally be inclined to play one. Queen takes queen. What's wrong with this? Consider your opponent's threats, especially any checks he can give, and you see his reply 1. Knight moves to f4, check. A discovered check that lets black win back the queen. Next move, 2 king moves to e1, knight takes queen. White still does well, 3 rook takes rook, check. Rook takes rook, 4. Knight takes rook, king takes rook, 5. King moves to e2 and 6. King takes at e3 and white has won the exchange and a pawn. But the really important question is whether you can resist being mesmerized by these possibilities and instead step back and observe the constrained position of black's king. It cannot move, and there is an open diagonal running toward it. This raises the thought of queen moves to d5, check. A move that would mate but for the black rook on d8 that protects the mating square. But don't stop there, either. See that white already has 2 pieces trained on f8, and also would be prepared to mate there with rook takes rook again, but for black's rook on d8. So the d8 rook becomes the focus of white's energies. He would like to threaten it in a fashion that forces it to leave the defense of one of the 2 mating squares, f8 or d5. Attacking it with a check would force black's reply helpfully, and the way to achieve this is suggested by those dual threats just described. We said that white's 1. Queen moves to d5 was a threat of almost mate, but at the same time it also is a queen fork of black's king and rook. Black is forced to reply rook takes queen, and now he has left the way clear for white to play to. Rook takes rook, checkmate. Black also has the option of playing the useless interpositions queen moves to e6 and rook moves to f7, white's queen just eats them up. Thus 1. Queen moves to d5 leads to a quick mate for white. This is another example of a point we emphasized earlier, the importance of looking beyond the first mating idea you see and inspecting for more. If you saw one of the possibilities here but not the other, you would miss out on a chance to end the game. White to move. What is the best move? Using pawns to threaten the guard. Part of your assessment of every position is a look at what you attack and why the attacks can't be turned into captures. In the current frame the only piece white attacks is black's bishop on d5. How is the bishop protected? By black's queen. The natural thought is to seek a safe and effective way to drive the queen from its perch. There is one move for white that satisfies those criteria, pawn from h3 moves to h4. Of course black would like to just move his queen to another square where it would be safe and still protect the d5 bishop. There is no such square, however, so once black moves his queen to safety, white plays bishop takes bishop. Lesson: don't overlook pawns as tools for attacking the guards of pieces you want to take.